Welcome to the Isabel Baggage Claim. Today we are going to be talking with J-Rock about when we say sexual maltreatment. Excited to learn more. Woo! J-Rock, how are you doing today?
Hello, Anna. I'm grateful. Thanks for asking.
I'm grateful too. I'm glad that you're here. And for those of you who did not watch last week and get to meet J-Rock, anything else you'd like to add about your work before we jump in?
A big fan of the Isabel community and a member.
We love having J-Rock on our team to have conversations about how we can best take care of people from a trauma-informed mindset. So today we are going to talk about when we say sexual maltreatment. And I am going to pull up an excerpt of our presentation that we use when we do our Isabel certifications. So this is a program called Get Isabel Certified. We do these online every 6 to 8 weeks. So if you're curious about this, you can join one of these programs. When I say sexual maltreatment, that's not a term that everybody is using. It's an umbrella term that I've created in response to an imaginary spectrum that I believe is in your mind. On one end of the spectrum, we have the word slavery, and on the other end of the spectrum, we have the word harassment. And then in between, there are all of these really scary words. And the scary words all are defined on different areas on the spectrum, depending on what industry you're working in, or really just personal associations. Now, we use this term in the Isabel community to help invite people into the conversation and also to be conscious of people who may have negative reactions, emotional reactions to some of those most scary words. So that is the formalized version of how I talk about the word sexual maltreatment. The reason I was looking for a different word to use, when we first produced Isabel in 2018, we used the words assault and abuse. And in the Isabel show, you don't hear the word rape until you're 2/3 of the way into the musical. You just start to suspect that something bad had happened in the past. And that's on purpose, to prep people for the moment where that word happens and where we learn really what that means. I had two very prominent mentors who were recruiting sponsors for the show and inviting people to the show. One is a therapist she's like 70. She's been a therapist for like 50 years. And another one's a lawyer, a very prominent local lawyer who used to work in courtrooms and as an advocate, and just lots of mental health background. And when they were inviting people to a musical about assault, they were getting ghosted. And they were mystified that their community of people who they perceived to know how to say no to them were ghosting them. And it made them really sad. And they didn't want me to get stuck in whitewashing, but it challenged me to think of, like, is there an intro term that we can use in certain moments? And that's what led me to finding sexual maltreatment. But it is something I have to be careful with, because it's not okay to use it to whitewash or like tone down someone's experiences. And it absolutely tones it down. So it has to be used carefully. So now that you've heard some of the origin story of that word for me, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I do remember you at some of those live events talking about the response, depending on the terminology that was used. And I think that this speaks to a larger concern and a larger problem that we have as a culture, that we really have a difficult time knowing how to grieve with other people and how to hold space for pain and hold space for sadness. And I think some of that comes from our own inability to do that within ourselves, so that when we don't know what to say, we just don't say anything. And one of the things that I've written into my curriculum in talking about how to support survivors is that it's also okay to say that I don't know the words, or I feel embarrassed that I don't even know what to say, but I want to let you know that I'm with you, that I believe you, that I'm here. And then also to model that and demonstrate that. So for anybody that knows someone that has been a survivor or a victim of assault, that they can use that and just say, like, I don't know exactly what to say, but I believe you, I support you, and I'm here. And then to check in with them regularly so they don't feel ghosted. Because if the folks that were helping just promote an event felt ghosted, how much more would a survivor of assault feel? So to that end, I think we do have some sense of almost like a meeting of the minds, having to kind of compromise a bit so that what we're talking about can be palpable and it can be digested by larger numbers of people, because when we work together as communities to address these issues, we tend to get more done. And so sometimes I think there almost does have to be sort of the consideration of an introductory phrase, you know, sexual maltreatment or sexual assault, versus saying, okay, today we're going to talk about rape. You know, it's difficult for people to digest. And even though people know that these things happen, and a lot of people are survivors themselves that are quiet survivors of it, and perhaps they've never disclosed it, to be met with the immediate need to address this, I think also comes with some sort of sense of unassigned guilt, that they weren't able to help prevent these things happening from people, to people rather, that they love, or maybe even just so commonly throughout our culture. So, and then we know finally also the way that the brain works with trauma. A trauma response is to shut down or is to become numb and disconnect. So I think it also ties into that a bit, that the vicarious trauma of even hearing what has happened to someone else affects people in such a way that they shut down. And it's not that they're necessarily wanting to be dismissive, narcissistic, disconnected, or non-empathetic, but they literally just get into like a freeze mode out of that fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah, I think that guilt that you mentioned, what was the word adjective you used before guilt?
I don't even
I bet
remember.
you know a lot of them. As a therapist, there's a lot of ways to say guilt.
Yeah.
Well, it was the guilt of not having prevented it,
Yeah.
and feeling responsible for, because we all do feel responsible for each other, even if we resist
Mhm.
it. And sometimes I think our most shame-filled like behavior is coming from a place of, I feel responsible for this. And that makes sense to me in the context of, it's often easier to be supportive of a stranger than of yourself, because the closer, like if somebody tells me that they were harmed at a school that I've never been to, and it's very far away, and oh, their friends didn't believe them, and oh, their parents were mean to them, it's very easy to say, everyone should believe you, everyone should
Mhm.
support you, because it's them. And if it's somebody close to me, well, then, okay, now you're talking about my teachers who I've connected to. Now it's who've helped me in some way, and they haven't helped you, and how to reconcile that. Or you were not believed by your best friend who's my best friend. It's so much harder. And then I feel more, if it's close to me, I feel more responsible. So, and I am more empowered to help when it's close to me, but that's terrifying.
Yeah.
So the shutdown makes a lot of sense. I've One of my fears with so I love using the term sexual maltreatment, and because it helps me as a survivor to stay engaged, because I've been to a lot of therapy, I've done a lot of EMDR work. So now those scary words on the spectrum, they don't always trigger me, but they still sometimes do. And by trigger, I mean make me to lose my sense of presence. Having PTSD often it's for the way I describe it is, I get confused my present self with my past self, and I get confused
Yeah.
with my present situation and my past situation. So sometimes those words, I forget where I am, and I feel like I don't know who I am when I hear those words. And I have to do a reframing of, if someone says rape, I'm thinking that happened to me. It feels like it's happening to me. And I have to tell myself that happened to me. It is not happening
Mhm.
to me. And then do different grounding exercises. And it's difficult to do that and just continue the conversation. And often people are using those words in passing, casually, and
Mhm.
expecting to just pivot into their next point of their day. So me saying sexual maltreatment allows me to be an advocate, to be present, because I can say that over and over and over again, and it doesn't make me feel like I'm
Mhm.
losing my sense of self or my sense of presence. So, and then the fact that people have to ask me, what does that mean? And then I get to explain it, that's a power shift in the conversation. So
Mhm.
that's my favorite part of it, is that it lets me do the work that I'm doing. It was hard to find my place as a survivor in support, and it was like I found a secret code that lets me engage and brings in
Yeah.
those other people, like the ones who were ghosting my mentors. But my fear is that people will see this word as like the new hot term and start correcting each other in a way that's really harmful. And do you have any thoughts on that, or like what could happen or what should not happen with this word?
Yeah, I mean, and I think another neat thing about using the word maltreatment is that it also invites the concept for people that there's a spectrum.
Hmm.
Whereas before, I think when we thought about the terminology, maybe from like the 60s, 70s, 80s of like abuse, people got that that was something that was criminal, that was something that was um, there was no gray area there. It was very direct. And so maltreatment kind of helps us to better understand that there is somewhat of a spectrum as it relates to sexual assault and sexual abuse, um, but that all of it needs to be explored and understood to better help serve the folks that are trying to heal and recover from it. And I do think that you know when you're doing this kind of work and you start to share information and ideas, we can't necessarily control how culture uses it and how that how if it becomes the next pop culture term. If it does, I will say this, it just gives you another opportunity to then go back and double down and say, okay, but also let's not make this an opportunity to become dismissive or disconnected from what's really happening to people.
I like that recasting. I guess it would be a good problem to have if a word I chose to use was getting so popular it was misused.
Right. Yeah, because at least it's still being talked about, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I agree.
One of the things that I'll do when I pitch it in the Get Isabel Certified event is I'll say my team is trained to use this proactively and not reactively,
Hmm.
which means when we're the first people bringing up abuse, assault, rape, any of those things, we're going to say sexual maltreatment, and it acts as like it reads the room, because the advocates will start using, well, the door opens for the people who are informed to use scarier words, and then the
Hmm.
door also opens for people who are resistant or uninformed to ask questions. What do you mean by that? It's really important. If anybody says assault, rape, abuse, I don't ever correct them. And most importantly, if somebody says, I was, insert scary word, I don't ask them to say, even if what they're saying is triggering, I never say, hey, please say that you were sexually maltreated, because that is
Yeah.
such a watered down version of what happened.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, and then even, I don't think as of yet I've used it correctively even for people who have not experienced abuse. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
because I think it's better to be proactive with it.
Yeah. And I have also seen too where some survivors, because for a lot of survivors, there's this tendency to feel that they don't want to sort of inconvenience people, or that their problem is too big or too difficult or too scary to talk about. So I have seen in some cases where survivors feel more comfortable using terms like maltreatment or assault versus saying rape or incest or sodomy, or these very much terms that lend themselves to much more graphic ideas, and it evokes much more graphic imagery. So for them, sometimes they can sit across the room, or they can stand and testify publicly, or they can speak to a group of people and say that they were victims of assault or maltreatment, and it softens the blow of the delivery for them too. So
Mm,
that's another part that is very individual and it's very customized. Like there's no one size fits all, I think. But the fact that we're having the dialogue becomes important. And I will say also, when it comes to reporting and it comes to like forensic interviews or law enforcement, I do think that the more specific the terminology, the better.
absolutely.
You're going to be able to better determine your next proper like level of care and treatment planning if they have a better and clearer picture of what has actually happened. So in those settings, um, it is absolutely, I think, important to be very more specific. And then also when you're sitting across the room from a provider or clinician, that they can better understand how to serve you in your healing and recovery process.
I think that's a great outline of a couple of situations where it's so important to use the specific terms. And
Yeah.
I think that I'd like to close out our conversation by addressing two possible imaginary audience members and just give them some final thoughts. One would be, um, if a survivor of anything on the spectrum is listening to this, and I think a final thought I'd want to say to them is, you get to choose. And the purpose of this conversation isn't to cause stress that leads to, oh no, now I have to find exactly the right words, because you don't. You define the words for you. And I also, if you feel stressed, then that is okay too. Do you have any final thoughts for imaginary person number one, who's a survivor?
Yeah, I think I could just piggyback off of what you were saying. Is just that you have a choice, and this isn't meant to force you into some sort of box or some sort of label. I think that one of the byproducts of experiencing trauma is feeling trapped or feeling forced to do something or to make a decision or feeling there's not a way out. So what we want to do is actually offer you a plethora of choices in which you can navigate and re-identify who you are, redefine your identity. And while sexual assault and sexual maltreatment doesn't have to completely define you, you can begin to interweave it into your experience. So you're not what has happened to you, but these experiences are part of who you're reframing and becoming, and you have a choice in how you articulate that to the world. And that feels kind of empowering, because that story and that experience, that's yours to hold on to, and you get to honor that space, and only you get to tell it in the way that you can.
That's beautiful. Thank you. The second imaginary listener that I'd like to address is the primary audience for Isabel. That's the people who have not experienced sexual violence. We are a community that's created by a survivor for supporters of a survivors. And a brief interjection of humor, J-Rock, I don't think I told you this in our last conversation, but I used to call people like survivors and non-survivors like they were zombies. Like, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. My husband, my then boyfriend, we were like at an event with all these old people, and I was like, yeah, survivors think this and non-survivors think this, and these old people are like, what is going on? And Daniel's like, it sounds like you're talking about dead people. It's like, oh.
Oh, wow. Yep, I get it.
So I don't call anyone that anymore. But for those who have not experienced any form of sexual violence,
Yeah.
closing thoughts, I would like to say, like, if this feels hard and if it feels strenuous, I would encourage you to acknowledge that first it's hard to think through new words. And the reason you feel resistance to it could be because it is a choice for you. You don't have to. If you've not been victimized, you have less need to be careful with your words. But if you've ever felt powerless when you hear a story, there's so many times that you're going to wish that you could have done something, and changing your words is something you can do. So for me, even with things like, I'm a white person and I'm learning more about how to be an anti-racist, or any experience I haven't had, when people ask me to change the words, I'm grateful because it's something that I can do, and there's so much that I can't do. So I hope that you'll channel that resistance to this into empowerment and gratitude. Do you have any closing thoughts, J-Rock, for the?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's such an opportunity to better connect to humanity. And I think, again, like with so many different types of oppression, if we could look at sexual maltreatment and assault as a human rights issue, so that it doesn't have this separate sort of mysterious category off somewhere off in the distance and no one really wants to look at or take or talk about, but it's a human rights, issue and an abuse of power. And so even if it's not something that you have particularly experienced for yourself, chances are that if you sit in a room next to a few people, 3 out of 4 of those people have. And so this can better give you what I like to call empathy reps, give you some repetition around empathy, and also cultural empathy, so that you better understand the cultural context of other people, and that you don't have to sit in the seat of that experience in order to connect and to support. And that's what's really, really important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, J-Rock, for talking about this. I am looking forward to seeing what people think and reading the comments and hearing about other conversations that can pivot from this.
Yeah, let's keep this conversation going. You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I loved talking about that with J-Rock, didn't you? If you'd like to share your thoughts on when to say sexual maltreatment or abuse or other words, please feel free to comment. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, or share whatever you feel comfortable with on your preferred platform. We're excited to talk with you again, where we'll be doing Adulting with Anna, connecting something from normal life to the business world to music for your enjoyment. All right, bye. When we say sexual maltreatment, excited to learn more. Ow, that hurt. This is taller than I thought. Okay, excited to learn more. Woo! Haven't decided what lame motion to use yet. We're in there.